Thank you for coming tonight to listen to my exploration of some of the philatelic implications of Samuel de Champlain. Why Champlain is the question that I had to ask myself, but I think there's several good reasons for it. First of all, Champlain was absolutely seminal in the creation of Canada. And we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. I think the approach that Champlain used towards Indigenous people became somewhat of a model for early Canada. That's another important piece. He had remarkable off-the-scale skills as a map maker, as an explorer, and as an administrator. And the last one perhaps as significant as anything. Another reason, there's a personal piece to it in that as an undergraduate, I had a professor who intrigued me a great deal, and he became my advisor in graduate school, and in fact, a dear friend and the godparents of our children. His name is Conrad Heidenreich, and he is one of the seminal, most important Champlain scholars in the country. So for 40 years, I've been hearing stories about Champlain. But you need to understand that I am not a Champlain expert. I have a lot of interest in it, but I'm not an expert. There is a paucity of philatelic evidence that explores Champlain. And there are some reasons for that, which will become evident as we move through. So it was a bit of a challenge in some ways. But I think, in the end, that history is always supported by philately. And I hope that maybe we can say something about that tonight. So, a little humorous story. When I sent the pictures to Leon Mathis to make the announcement, he very quickly came back to me and said, are you sure you want a picture of Jacques Cartier in a Samuel de Champlain presentation? And I was so impressed that he got that. But yes, indeed, I did, because I think that if you're going to understand Champlain historically, you also need to have some of the background that allowed Champlain to perform as he did. Jacques Cartier traveled to Canada in the dates listed, certainly starting in 1534. Explored the Gulf of St. Lawrence extensively. He went up the St. Lawrence River. He visited Stadacona and Hochelaga. Stadacona was at Quebec and Hochelaga at Montreal. He is responsible for naming the promontory at Quebec, Cap Diamant. He brought with him a bunch of convicts as well as some colonists. And his quest was for God, glory, and gold, except that those are reversed from the order that was important to them in France at the time. It was really about gold and how to make money out of Canada. Let's be absolutely clear that this is not the first voyage of Europeans to North America, nor is it the first voyage into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. What it is the first time that the French decided to settle, to have a residence, a colony is a generous term, but a settlement in somewhere in this area that became Canada. Francis I, King of France, sent Jacques Cartier with orders to establish a presence in North America. In other words, moving it from a fishing source to a more significant European presence in this area. Now, Jacques Cartier came from Saint-Malo, and Saint-Malo is just in this area of Western France, and it is indeed a significant harbor. You can see the outflow there and the location of Saint-Malo. When Jacques Cartier came to Canada, he visited with the Iroquoian Indigenous folk that were along the St. Lawrence, and specifically traveled to, as I said before, Montreal, where Montreal stands today, in Quebec. And those trips, and we need to understand this, if we're going to understand this history, were facilitated expressly by the indigenous population. But Cartier made some errors. The first error was he brought convicts with his colonists. Not a good mix. He was looking for the Orient. Okay, that's fine. They had no clue that there was a massive continent in between the route to the Orient, but that's why he traveled up the river, up the St. Lawrence River. One thing he did do was at Cap Diamant at Quebec, they found gold and diamonds. And they scourged the area and loaded their ships with gold and diamonds and took them back to France. Of course, I think most of us know now that it wasn't gold and diamonds, it was pyrite and quartz. His settlement was Cherbourg Royal. About 1540, this was founded, and that's a particularly glorified artistic representation. But Cartier was not able to develop effective Indigenous relations. The relations became quite fractious, and in fact, he kidnapped the chief Donnaconna's two sons and had to flee home. The stamp, of course, that honors Cartier from 1934 is there, and I'll tell you now, and you probably hear a lot of this as we go forward, that's really not Cartier, but I'll be talking about that as we move forward. And as a result of those pyrite and quartz discoveries, there's a saying in France, "Faux comme les diamants du Canada," as fake as diamonds from Canada. So thank you very much, Jacques Cartier. Cartier was also, interestingly enough, the first person to refer to Percé Rock. At the time, Percé Rock was significantly larger and had more holes in it, as it were. Saint-Malo, that seafaring port, is represented on two French stamps that are quite interesting. The first one is 1938, and typical of that era, the used stamp is worth significantly less than the mint never hinged stamp, and that's fairly typical of French stamps at that period. The Second World War was not favorable to Saint-Malo, and you can see the second stamp, which is a semi-postal, intended to help with reconstruction, but the ruins of Saint-Malo were significant. This pair of stamps from 1934 in France honored Jacques Cartier. The ships are about the only thing there that's actually accurate. These also are early commemoratives, one of the first that the French government authorized, but the used set's $650, but a mint never hinged set is $210. That's what that is. I didn't pay that for it. The French have a bit of a reticence, not totally, but hesitation perhaps to celebrate the regal past. But this art stamp of Francis I was issued in 1967, the king that sent Cartier on his way. Those ships, by the way, are extremely seaworthy. They're small and they get tossed around a lot, but they handle the sea extremely well. You can see there the Tercentenary 20 cent, which is the arrival of Cartier at Quebec. The ships aren't quite right, but it's pretty close. And there's an inn near Brouage, and we'll talk about Brouage a bit more as we talk about Champlain, that honors this ship at the door. This is from the 1500s, and if you want a better picture of it, there it is. Cherbourg Royal, that Cartier founded, is further west than the current Quebec City or Cap Diamant, which is to the extreme upper right of that map, and you can see it there. And I've not been there, and in fact, I had dinner at the Saint-Hubert, which is about 1 kilometer from it in the summer, and I wish I'd known. I would have gone and seen it. So, where is Champlain in all this? Why start with Cartier? I think it's essential because of the lessons that were learned. First, a better site needed to be chosen if the French were going to settle in North America. Second, better mapping was absolutely essential. And better relations with the indigenous population, if anything was going to happen, the indigenous people were essential. Essentially, Jacques Cartier failed in his mandate. He did not establish a settlement, But what he did do is create a legacy for settlement in North America. And that seed was well sown by Cartier. Between Cartier in 1542 and Champlain in 1608, the founding of Quebec, it wasn't a dead zone for France. France continued to travel back and forth in those years, and specifically, they were looking for furs. It's no surprise to Canadians to understand that the fur trade helped establish this country. In the last voyage of that nature that is tracked, there were obviously many more, was 1601. And then Champlain appears on the scene about 1603. So, Champlain. Champlain was born at a town called Brouage, which is outlined in red dots on the left map here. It's just south of La Rochelle, and La Rochelle to historians is the city of the Huguenot displacement and the slaughter of Huguenots by the French. And so there are some religious issues for sure there. And the map on the right is Brouage in 1635. You can see the harbor outlined just to the north. Champlain's house is indicated, and no doubt you recognize the fortifications around that town. There's the French stamp that honors Brouage. It shows those battlements very clearly, and they're significant when you see them. There's an older photo of Brouage with the water in front of it, but as often happens in coastal areas, the coast has moved away from the town, and you can see on that map that much of it has been silted and drainage has been installed, agriculture, of course. And there's an aerial photo of what Brouage looks like today. It's quite a distance from the sea, and it's certainly no longer the harbor that it once was. When Champlain arrived in North America in 1603, he was ordered in, well, Henry IV was king in France, and he was ordered a St. Lawrence survey, well aware that there was potential in North America. And Champlain was the person hired to do the survey, not to conduct the trip. That was left to the commander, who was Aymar de Chaste. When they got there, the St. Lawrence was depopulated. There were no Iroquois, there was no Stadacona, there was no Hochelaga. And partly that was disease introduced by Cartier and other Europeans over the last 100 years before they arrived. Partly it was indigenous warfare. The Iroquois had moved south of the St. Lawrence and south of Lake Ontario, but that probably is another presentation. So some of the stamps that represent these folk, there's Henry IV. Henry IV was a long-reigning king. He was highly respected. He also was the king responsible for the Edict of Nantes, which settled the Protestant Catholic issue that had caused so much grief through the west coast of France, and specifically in La Rochelle. In 1610, he was assassinated by a fanatical Catholic. And there is his successor, Louis XIII. Louis XIII is perhaps less remarkable as a ruler than Henry IV. However, he is known for several things, and we'll talk a bit about that moving forward. It's interesting also to note that there are suggestions that Champlain was a Huguenot and converted to Catholicism. Today, we wouldn't think twice about this. It's nothing. Then it was very important. If you were going to be successful at court, you had to adhere to the Catholic faith. He did manage to hold the king's favor from Henry IV and also Louis XIII throughout his lifetime. He was an extremely nimble diplomat. He navigated the court extremely well. He was extremely popular. And with one person in particular, that was very important. And that is Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu had the reins of power under Louis XIII and the faith of the king, and he pretty much controlled what France did. That's the portrait from which that stamp was created. He became Champlain's mentor, if you like, and Champlain his protege. In fact, Champlain spent time in the basement of the Louvre exercising his cartographic skills. Richelieu was so important to Canada. He did several things that solidified the French interest in North America. One, he formed the Company of 100 Associates. Two, after Quebec was lost to the British in 1629, he got it back in 1632. And he supported Champlain without fail throughout his life. Quebec was founded on the 3rd of July, 1608. This is a map from 1744 by Nicolas Belin. And I think it shows, even for the time, how significant Quebec was. You can see the Ile d'Orléans and the other islands further east on the St. Lawrence, and you can see the tributary rivers. It's just a wonderful piece of evidence about that time. But the situation of Quebec is so critical to the French, but also to the founding of Canada. Of course, that's a modern picture from the summer of Quebec City and the Chateau Frontenac. I'll comment on Frontenac later, but you can see the St. Lawrence from La Citadelle, which is, of course, the Canadian Forces base on Cap Diamant. And looking the other way, you can see from that point, you can see the north shore of the St. Lawrence, you can see the south shore of the St. Lawrence, and you can see the Ile d'Orléans. One of the things that helped Champlain immensely was that the population of the St. Lawrence when he arrived, not Iroquois, was now Algonquian. It was the Montagnais and other groups of Algonquian speakers. The Algonquians are woodland indigenous folk, and they're somewhat different than the Iroquois. And in fact, the Iroquois and the Algonquins were at loggerheads with each other. Champlain's mapping reflects those relations with indigenous people. So if you look at this early map by Champlain, you'll see the East Coast fairly well identified, Nova Scotia, the Anticosti Island, named that at the time, Newfoundland. You see Cape Breton, the St. Lawrence River. But as you move further west, things become much more indistinct. Hudson's Bay is not accurate, although it's there, with a lot of fictitious stuff hanging around in it. And the Great Lakes are sort of bubbles in the middle of those rivers, very unclear. And there's a reason for this. It's accurate, but it's accurate based on indigenous information. Indigenous folks saw distance differently than Europeans. Europeans spent their time mapping mathematically. Indigenous people mapped based on time of travel. And it's a very different way of saying exactly the same thing. Champlain's later map becomes even more accurate, to use that word. And certainly you can now see Lake Ontario and Lake Huron, and that reflected his travels inland, which we'll talk about in a little while. So certainly the Algonquian presence facilitated what Champlain did, and these stamps, of course, the Canadian series of stamps honoring Indigenous folk, and you can see that Algonquians, as an example, lived in conical structures. This reflected where they lived and how they traveled throughout the Canadian Shield, while Iroquoians, who lived further south, often lived in longhouses, certainly for the winter, and had an entirely different culture. They're different nations. In fact, one could say that the Algonquian relations were critical in establishing the east-west-north direction of this country. In 1609, Champlain traveled to Lake Champlain with the Algonquians, with the Montagnais, and met the Iroquois at Lake Champlain. And in a significant, for the development of Canada, battle, the first use of guns in that structure with indigenous populations occurred, and the Montagnais were successful over the Iroquois. The result of that little escapade was that the Iroquois turned away from any attempt to work with the French on the St. Lawrence and instead moved towards the Dutch and the English through New York City, or what became New York City. And that in itself was significant, and the liaison, the alliance between the French and the Algonquians, and later the Cree, across the Great Lakes and into the Huron country was the sort of foundation for what happened. So in 1608, Champlain arrived at Quebec City, and the diagram on the left is the habitation that he built, the first structure, European structure in North America, and certainly what became Canada, in a lasting sense. This structure doesn't last, but the presence does. And that diagram comes from Les Voyages de 1613 de Samuel de Champlain, his own book, so one can assume that it was fairly accurate. And what impresses me is that the Canadian Post Office actually got the diagram correct on the 5-cent tercentenary stamp. It's not common, and there's reasons for that we'll get to. Later on, in 1620, Champlain established the Chateau Saint Louis. And again, we're going back to Quebec City because the habitation was on the flats by the river. Made great sense. Easy transport, easy unloading and loading, and it eminently wise to have a settlement there. And today, you certainly, if you go down the funicular to the Bas-Vie, you can see the importance of that area. And some of the oldest buildings of Quebec are down there. But there were merits to going up, and one of them was visual. You could see down that river that we looked at earlier. The other is that you could use armaments there. And he established what later became the Chateau Saint Louis. It was initially a fort, and the reason for the picture is that you can see where it is. If you look a little closer, this is in front of the Chateau Frontenac. It's called the Dufferin Terrace. It was formed by Governor General Lord Dufferin in the 1800s, and its intent was to allow people to walk along the promontory and view the river. And if you look a little closer, it's quite nice. In fact, it's just been redone, and it was redone because underneath it is the foundation of the Chateau Saint Louis. Fascinating to walk through it. There's not a whole lot left. That happens to be the ice house, or the ice storage, the base of it anyway. And you can spend a couple of hours underneath there looking at that, at Champlain's Chateau Saint Louis. Later on, the late 1700s, a fellow by the name of Frontenac was the governor, and he extended it and built it much more significantly than it was originally. And I will tell you a story. We were in Quebec City, and I walked into the Chateau Frontenac, and I saw this beautiful portrait of an old French person. And I went up to the concierge, and I said, "Who's the portrait?" "Don't do that in the Chateau Frontenac. It's Frontenac." Something you can't miss when you're in Quebec City is the Champlain Monument. It's beside the Chateau Frontenac and overlooks the St. Lawrence. It was built in 1608 to honor the tercentenary. This happened quite a bit across Canada, actually. It was a big deal. And it's a stunning monument that was honored on the $1 stamp that's there. So it's not an exact replication. I didn't get the angle totally correct, but it's pretty cool. Champlain spent a good deal of his early days traveling. 1604 to 7, he explored the east coast of the Bay of Fundy and Nova Scotia, as far south as Massachusetts. In 1609, we've already talked about his expedition to Lake Champlain and the results there. And then in 1613 to 1615, he traveled inland up the Ottawa River and across through Lake Nipissing. In fact, there's a falls on just to the west of Lake Nipissing called Recollet Falls. And it's called Recollet Falls because when it's a dangerous falls. And when they went through it, 2 Recollet priests drowned in it. Hence, it became Recollet Falls. And then down Georgian Bay to the Huron country. And he certainly visited Orillia, the large Huron settlement just west of Orillia was called Cayagway, and he certainly was at that site. And then down through the what became the Trent Severn system and into upstate New York. So extensive travels. They did not continue. They stopped because he became much more of an administrator in his last years there. And I think we also need to recognize that in 1603, before the settlement at Quebec, he also traveled as far as Hochelaga, Montreal. So he's pretty familiar with the inland of that part of North America. Champlain died on Christmas Day, 1635. He was plus or minus 65. We're not sure of his birth date. It could have been anywhere between 1567 and 1580. Best guess, 1570, so we can say 65. No clue where he was buried. There's been a quest in Quebec to find those remains, if possible, and several times they've thought they had them, but they haven't been able to prove it. When he died, Quebec was a town of less than 270 people. But the legacy was established. Active French immigration policies were in place, and by 1750, Quebec's population soared, and it was up in the tens of thousands by 1750, and the colony was firmly established. Again, primarily an East-West Indigenous partnership. You can see that in his travels, and you can see that in the way produce was delivered to Quebec. If you're interested and you haven't read Louise Penny, there is a novel that she wrote called Don't Bury Your Dead, in which they think they found Champlain's grave. It's one of the several plot lines of the book, and it talks about this place, which is the Literary and Historical Society of Quebec. If you haven't been there and you go to Quebec City, I would highly recommend a visit. It's fascinating. It's a step out of time. And the interesting thing about this picture, there's lots of history here. We could probably spend an hour talking about the picture. But if you look on the left at these red books, those happen to be the collection of the Champlain Society. The Champlain Society was formed in Toronto in 1605 to publish historical documents and in their manuscript version. And there have been several editions of Champlain's work. So we need to talk a little about the things that sometimes get associated with Champlain. Some are sort of cute. In 1908, again, the tercentenary statue was established in Montreal, but we need to talk a little about an astrolabe first. The instrument that person in the diagram is carrying is an astrolabe. It's an instrument of navigation that was used before more sophisticated instruments like the sextant were developed. And it was used to measure location against the sun. And in the Ottawa monument, Champlain, as it were, is holding an astrolabe, but you can see the difference. In fact, the monument is wrong. An astrolabe is not held that way. It's held the way it's presented in the first diagram. This was erected at Nepean Point. It is the spot where he made a solar observation on his travels through there. The statue has been removed, and the point is now Quebec Point, and the statue's been moved further south, and a kneeling scout replaces it. Now, it's a legacy in Canada, and I've alluded to this sort of thing. First is sheer determination and obsession with this land. He was infatuated by North America, by Quebec, and just became an advocate for it. He made dozens of trips across the ocean and advocated at court. Just a marvelous reach that he had. His Indigenous relations and approach are absolutely critical to what became Canada. And if you haven't read it, I would highly encourage, although he doesn't talk about Champlain, he does talk about the impact of Indigenous culture on this country. And that's John Ralston Saul's book called A Fair Country. Thousands of place names in this country have been named after him, and he certainly established the cultural foundation of Quebec and, as I say, much of Canada. Now, the stamps below are not Champlain. The stamps below are of Martin Frobisher. Frobisher and Champlain no doubt met in the 1590s in the Caribbean when Champlain was there. Frobisher had explored the extreme north of Canada, and I've certainly read where the implication is that Champlain took his opinion of how to relate to Indigenous people from Frobisher. That is categorically not true. Frobisher's relations with Indigenous people were that they were not human. And some of the things he did in the far north are reprehensible even by the standards of the 1580s. Champlain was significantly different. And I would suggest, although I have no proof for it, that Champlain probably heard from Frobisher what he thought and decided that that's not the way I'm going to play the game. So we need to talk a little about Champlain's portrait. Recently, somebody asked me about this, and I was in the wrong mood, so I really let rip on the poor old Champlain's portrait. But here's the history of it. Balthasar Montcornet in 1654 created the portrait that's before you of Michel Particelli. Michel Particelli was a courtier. He was reportedly extremely disliked at court, but he got his portrait made in 1654. In 1854, Louis César Joseph Ducornet stole it and created a portrait of Samuel de Champlain, which you see before you. And you're bound to recognize this. This is sort of woven throughout Canadian culture in some ways. The Quebecer, Théophile Hamel, in 1866 embellished it. And again, another source. And lastly, Eugène Ronjat in 1875 made Champlain into an elderly man who, for Laverdiere's book on Champlain. So the portrait evolved over time. It's fake. The whole thing is fake. An interesting subnote is that Louis César Joseph Ducornet was fascinating. This man was born with no arms, no thighs, and only 4 toes on his right foot. And he painted with those 4 toes. And that is remarkable. So, what is the real Champlain? Well, is it this guy? That's one depiction that we've seen, because in the absence of truth and fact, imagination takes place. This is out of the Ottawa newspaper, Champlain in his regalia greeting the Indigenous population. I don't know about this guy. And that is somewhat the same as Ducornet's portrait. That's the statue de Champlain in Paris. Not to be outdone, C.W. Jeffreys, the great World War I artist who documented much of the World War I, took a run at Champlain. And the one thing I really like about Jeffreys' portrait is that he actually got this astrolabe correct. But here he is. This is Champlain. It is the only known factual portrait of Samuel de Champlain. And it tells us many things. That little guy in the center is Champlain. He drew this picture. So we can trust that at least the impression is correct. I mean, it's engraved afterwards, so things could change. What it tells us is that, first of all, he was bearded. Second of all, he was well-heeled financially. That is an arquebus, which was extremely expensive at the time. His clothing and his hat also represent a man of some substance. Don't know where that money came from or how he got it or whether it was court supplied, but it does give us a lot of information about Champlain. That's him. We'll talk a little about those Indigenous relations. I think these 2 maps, and they come from the Historical Atlas of Canada, speak to the impact, or at least the changes from 1540 to 1608 to 20, somewhere in that range. You can see certainly on the first map on the left that the Iroquois were along the entire St. Lawrence River in the early period, and some other changes, of course, if you look closely. And in this second period, the Iroquois were significantly south of the St. Lawrence and Lake Ontario, where the Algonquins had filled that gap with the Montagnais. This stamp, issued in 1958, was the 350th anniversary of Quebec. And I mean, the portrait is the portrait. but a sort of a cool little stamp. The covers took on a life of their own at the time, and certainly a simple one like this. And then that portrait again in brown, in green, and in beige. And then this whimsical one where Champlain is standing on a map of Quebec and that sort of pondering stance with no face. The monument at Quebec, the party at Quebec, I'm not sure. A bull. And lastly, the habitation with a ship which is fairly accurate to the time. The habitation, sadly, is more like Cherbourg Royal, which was Cartier. Here we have another habitation, which is better but not great. We have a ship. We have Washington apples. And, of course, the Grand Champlain, back to the portrait, Government of Quebec. And that is actually pretty close to the stamp. So covers have woven all over the place. There's certainly been other stamps that have involved Champlain. We have Cartier and Champlain on the tercentenary, 1 cent. Both portraits are fake. We have Quebec in 1700, and you can see Chateau Saint Louis in the lower village. Of course, Quebec. And that trip in 1606, 1607, 8, down the East Coast was a shared stamp with the United States. Champlain mapped much of what became Massachusetts and Maine and Connecticut, Rhode Island, and the United States recognized that. At least they didn't put a portrait on it. And then there's places like Orillia where Champlain stopped. And I just picked up this postcard last week, and the monument in Orillia and the Hotel Champlain in Orillia. Funny story there. My in-laws spent their wedding night and their honeymoon in that hotel. I didn't ask them if they were haunted by Champlain. And as coincidences will have it, the most recent Canadian philatelist has an article on Champlain in it. So if you're interested in pursuing that, and some wonderful pictures of the Champlain stamps. And I must thank whoever put this on the website as an advertising for Champlain. I'm going to keep that. I think it's maybe the best portrait we have. So there you go. Champlain. Thank you.